The Art of Living, Part 1, Virtue and Friendship. 1. Virtue and the Art of Living. I'll never forget the instructor's last words. So, if you happen to fall out of your kayak, don't try to stand up in the river. It was in our first year of marriage when my wife and I went kayaking in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. We were newbies to the kayaking world, so we went with a group led by a professional guide. He fitted us with our gear and, before we set off, gave many instructions about kayaking, including the warning about not standing up in the river. The river is not very deep, so you'll be tempted to try to stand up in it, he said. But it's also very powerful, so if you happen to fall out of your kayak, don't try to stand up in the river. It will knock you right down. Just hold on to your life jacket and wade to the side. After he completed his instructions, we jumped into our kayak. I took the front seat while Beth sat in back. Our first 5 minutes on the river were all smooth sailing. We were enjoying the clear blue skies, beautiful scenery, and snow-capped mountains as we kayaked down the calm, peaceful waters of the river. But we knew we would eventually be tested. We knew that soon we would have to face our first whitewater rapids. Suddenly we heard them, the roar of the rapids. My heart began to race. The adrenaline was pumping as I braced for this first challenge. Into the rapids we went. We immediately lost control, almost completely tilting over to the left as the waves came pouring in. We overcorrected and then almost capsized to the right, but we finally got a handle on things, straightened up, and pushed through to the other side, back on the smooth, peaceful waters of the river. We avoided a near disaster and conquered our first rapids. I turned around to rejoice with Beth, shouting, "We did it, honey!" But she had a look of horror on her face. She was frantically pointing forward and yelling, "Keep it straight! Keep it straight!" She noticed that as I had turned around to celebrate prematurely, the kayak had turned around with me. We were now going sideways down the river, and the momentum kept turning us around. We did a complete 180 and were now floating backward down the river. As we continued spinning around to make the full 360, I eventually got us straight again, but it was too late. A large log had fallen halfway across the river. While the rest of our group followed our guide around the log, we were headed straight for it. Our kayak hit the log and was immediately swept underneath it by the river, and the river was wanting to take us away too. We were desperately clinging to the log, holding on for dear life, not knowing what was on the other side of the tree and what would happen to us if we let go. I turned to my wife and said, "I love you, honey." And suddenly we too were pulled underwater, carried away by the river. Downstream, I drifted, having absolutely no control over where my body was going. I was inhaling water, and my rear end was hitting what seemed like every rock in the river. I didn't like that feeling. So can you guess what I tried to do? I attempted to stand up, and immediately the force of the river knocked me back down. In a panic, I tried a second time to stand up to catch some oxygen, and instantly I was pulled under the water. After a third failed attempt, I finally remembered the instructor's words, "Don't try to stand up in the river." Having returned to my senses, I held on to my life jacket, rose to the surface, took in some much-needed O2, and eventually made it safely to the side of the river. My wife survived too. I found her alive about half-mile downstream, and we haven't been kayaking since. Going against the current. It's hard to stand up against the flow of a powerful river. Similarly, it's hard to stand up against the current of our culture. There is not a lot of support from our secular, relativistic world for living the good life, a virtuous life, the life God intended us to live. Whether it is from the media, the workplace, our schools, and sometimes even our own families, we do not get a lot of support for building strong marriages and raising children of character. We don't get a lot of wise guidance for developing authentic friendships, living out healthy dating relationships, and thriving together in community. And we certainly don't get a lot of encouragement from our world on how to grow in faith and friendship with Jesus Christ. Quite the opposite. Many forces in the culture are constantly working against us. Think about some of the most important questions in life. What is love? What makes us happy? What is true beauty? What is marriage? What does success look like? What matters most in life? Our secular culture has strong opinions about these matters, and it's constantly selling us on its worldview. But the problem is not that these secular viewpoints are merely lacking in Christian content. Even worse, they often undermine what Jesus himself taught us about these things. Simply by living and breathing in this modern secular age, we are taking in large doses of a way of life that distracts us from what's truly most important and knocks us down in our pursuit of Christ's standards. Especially in today's cultural environment, simply having a good Christian values and knowing what is right and wrong is not enough. Of course, we need God's grace to carry us through, but grace builds on nature. So if we want to swim against the current of the culture, there is one other thing we need that is absolutely crucial. If we want thriving marriages, a strong family life for our children, and authentic friendships with others, in sum, if we desire to live our Christian faith deeply and not be swept away by how the world tries to get us to live, there is one other thing we need that is indispensable, and that's the pursuit of virtue. More than values. There's a big difference between values and virtues. When speaking at marriage retreats, I like to ask the married couples 2 questions. How many of you value your spouse? At this, all of them raise their hands. Then I ask a second question. How many of you do things that hurt your spouse? Most laugh, and then all the hands go up again. It's one thing to say that I value my spouse, children, friends, and God, and I may genuinely intend to love them all, but it's another thing to be a good husband, father, friend, and Christian. If I want to give the best of myself in all these relationships, I must have virtue. Virtues are so much more than values. We can have the noblest of ideals and most sincere of intentions, but still fall short of who we'd like to be. We can say, for example, that we value prayer, but fail to take time consistently every day for it. We can say we value our children, but still get grumpy and lose our tempers with them when they have a meltdown. We may truly value purity and chastity, but still struggle to guard our eyes and thoughts. We might say we entrust our lives to God's providential care, but still find ourselves struggling with fear, anxiety, or discouragement when things get hard in life. Having good values or noble aspirations for living a good life is not enough. We need virtue. The Catechism of the Catholic Church defines virtue as an habitual and firm disposition to do the good, 1803. Think of virtue as a certain excellence or disposition that equips us to love God and neighbor easily, as if it were second nature. Just as various sports, arts, and trades require certain habits, abilities, and skills, so the art of living requires virtue. The virtues are the fundamental dispositions we need to live our relationship with God and neighbor with excellence. As the Catechism explains, the virtues enable us to give the best of ourselves to the people in our lives and to all that we do, 1803. The question of virtue. I've always been fascinated by flying. As a child, I loved going to the airport and seeing planes take off and come in for landing. And when on board, I always wanted to sit by the window so that I could be enthralled by the fact that the clouds in the sky were now below me. To this day, while most frequent flyers prefer the aisle seat, I still sometimes choose the window because of how in awe I am about being in flight. Now let me ask you this question. Even though I have a passion for flying, would you ever want to get into an airplane with me at the controls? No way! I do not have the skills of a pilot. No matter how much I value flying, if I don't have the skills to fly a plane, you don't want to get on board with me in the cockpit. Similarly, in my childhood, I was fascinated by the idea of doctors performing surgery. My father was a surgeon, and I grew up watching him take care of his patients and looking at anatomy books and photos of surgical procedures. I admire my dad's work and continue to place such doctors in high esteem. However, would you want to get on the operating table with me as your surgeon just because I value surgery so much? Hardly. People may call me Dr. Sry, but I'm not that kind of doctor. Since I never went to medical school and do not possess the skills of a surgeon, you don't want me performing your operations. This is all common sense. No one would ever get into an airplane with someone who didn't have the skills of flying, and no one would ever hop on the operating table with someone who didn't possess the skills of surgery. Yet many people today jump into friendships, business partnerships, dating relationships, and even marriages without ever asking the fundamental questions of virtue. Does this person have the virtue necessary to live this relationship well? Does this person possess patience, generosity, humility, courage, and self-control? Do I possess those virtues? Am I ready for this relationship? In what areas am I personally falling short? If I want to be a man who is reliable, good friend, colleague, husband, and father, I need virtue to enable me to love the people in my life the way God intends me to love them. Anyone can say, I love you. Some people might sincerely mean it, but only a few actually have the character, the virtue, to be a reliable friend and love the people in their lives. If we want to be the kind of people who truly love, who give the best of ourselves to others, then we must be constantly seeking to grow in virtue. The freedom to love. This is an important point. When I was younger and heard people at church talk about the virtues, I had an individualistic view of the virtuous life. I had the mistaken impression that virtue was something good for merely my own soul, for my moral development, or my spiritual life. Humility, piety, kindness, prudence, temperance, these and other virtues seem to be simply good qualities every Catholic was supposed to have in order to be a good Christian. Virtues were like badges that made you a good Boy Scout for God. Virtue, however, should be understood rationally. The virtues are not important for merely one's own life. They are the habitual dispositions we need to love God and the people God has placed in our lives. Virtue gives us the freedom to love. When we possess virtue, we have the ability to give the best of ourselves to God and others. And our lack of virtue in certain areas doesn't harm just us, it negatively affects the people close to us. They will suffer the consequences of our lack of virtue. If I lack in generosity, for example, I will do selfish things that hurt my spouse. If I easily get frustrated and angry and lose my temper, the people around me will suffer. If I lack prudence and don't think things through, other people will be affected by my lack of foresight. If I don't have self-control and constantly look at my phone at every beep, buzz, and notification, I am unable to look at my children in the eyes and give them the love and attention they need from me. If I am prone to being discouraged, overwhelmed, or anxious, I will tend to be focused on myself, my troubles, my fears, my decisions, and likely transfer my stress to others and be unable to give the best of myself to the people around me. This is the most tragic thing about my deficiency in virtue. To the extent that I lack in virtue, I am not free to love. No matter how much I may desire to be a good son of God, a good husband to my wife, a good father to my children, without virtue, the fundamental disposition that enables me to love, I will not consistently give the best of myself to them. The art of living. Joseph Ratzinger, the man who became Pope Benedict XVI, once said that in our secular, de-Christianized culture, the problem is not simply that the world has lost the gospel. We have lost the most basic human values as well. We have lost what he calls the art of living. Footnote 1, Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, The New Evangelization Building the Civilization of Love, addressed to catechists and religious teachers, Jubilee of Catechists, December 12, 2000. Indeed, in an age of moral confusion, when the great tradition of the virtues has not been passed on, the challenge is not just that we don't know enough about Christian doctrine or the Church's moral teachings. The problem runs much deeper. We don't even know how to live. We don't know how to live friendship, community, dating, marriage, and family life well. We can earn advanced degrees, gain technical skills, build a successful career, and still not know how to thrive in our most basic relationships in life. Half of all marriages end in divorce, and even families that stay together are often fraught with problems of dysfunction, guilt, control, and abandonment. But it's not just marriage and family relationships that suffer today. Many people do not know how to live out something as basic as authentic friendship. A friendship in which the other person is truly committed to you, not to what he gets out of you. In a virtuous friendship, your friend seeks what is truly best for you. You and your friends are seeking together what matters most in life, the good life, the virtuous life. You don't have to impress this person and earn his love. You can let him see you as you really are because you have confidence that he is truly committed to you and your good. Friends like that are few and hard to find. Many people go through life never experiencing authentic friendship. In fact, people today are lonelier than ever. 2 in 5 Americans, for example, report feeling that their relationships are not meaningful, and only about half of them say they have meaningful social interactions, such as extended conversations with friends or family on a daily basis. With more than 1 out of 4 people not even having someone in whom they can confide personal matters. Think about that. Of the many people you see out in the world, half of them are not experiencing the basics of true human friendship each day. Our culture encourages us to connect digitally around the world, make as many friends as possible on social media, and watch other people live out their relationships on our favorite shows. But half of all people don't even have a single meaningful social interaction each day with the people in their own real lives. It's no wonder young people especially are hungering for any guidance they can get on the right approaches to dating, how to discern whether they and their beloveds are called to marriage, how to build strong marriages, how to deal with stress, conflict, and communication in marriage, how to raise children, how to discipline children, and how to make their home a school of faith for their family. I find that these topics on how to live friendship, dating, marriage, family, and the spiritual life are the ones that grab people's attention the most. And after hearing the church's wisdom on these matters, many wonder, why have I never heard this before? People are starving to learn the art of living. A vision for the virtues. Our culture might be able to build skyscrapers, rockets, and amazing technological gadgets, but we don't know how to train people in the most basic, most fundamental, indeed most human things in life, like living, friendship, and family. The modern world has failed to pass down the great traditions on the virtues. We lost sight of what has been handed down from generation to generation through the centuries, the art of living. Ancient thinkers like Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero, and Christian theologians like St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas tell a beautiful story of the virtues, how they are structured, how they relate together, and how they help us become the men and women God made us to be. From this tradition, we also learn much about the various weaknesses, vices, and sins that hinder our pursuit of virtue, and how to overcome those tendencies in our lives. Thankfully, in some Christian circles, there has been more talk about virtues in recent years, the importance of virtue, the need to grow in virtue, and how to practice the virtues. Still, many popular presentations depict the virtues in a fragmented way. 5 virtues you need to be successful, or 7 virtues for highly effective families, or 6 virtues for healthy dating relationships. These presentations, of course, can inspire people to live better lives, but we shouldn't think of the virtues as a list of various techniques, some kind of 5-step program, or a checklist of things to accomplish for our spiritual lives. I'm going to acquire 1 new virtue each week of Lent this year. The virtues go much deeper. They're not merely tasks, qualities, or action items. They take much time and grace to sink in. They involve the shaping of one's emotions, desires, character, and soul. Indeed, the possession and lack of virtue shapes who we are. The great tradition of the virtues offer a wonderfully coherent picture of who we are meant to be as integrated human persons. It sheds light on how God made us, how we are made to thrive together in community, why we have certain weaknesses, and why we struggle in our relationships. The tradition also points to how we can grow in virtue, overcome our faults, and live our friendships with greater excellence. Take, for example, the 4 classical human virtues known as the cardinal virtues, which are at the heart of this book: prudence, fortitude, temperance, and justice. The word cardinal in Latin means hinge. These 4 virtues are called cardinal, hinge, because all other human virtues can be seen as subcategories of these foundational 4. Some of the wisest thinkers in the history of humanity and the Bible itself saw that a successful life depends largely on how well we live these four cardinal virtues. One could say our lives hinge on them, yet most people today are not striving to grow in these virtues that are so crucial for the art of living. Many parents, educators, and leaders are not systematically training the next generation in these virtues. And it's no wonder most human beings today, unfortunately, are not even aware of the four cardinal virtues. But you likely are different. If you've picked up this book, it's probably because you already desire to become more virtuous than you are today. Something in your heart rises when you hear about the art of living and growing in virtue. You long to live in virtuous friendships, and you want to inspire virtue in those you love. The reflections in this book are not based on any one person's creative musings about virtue or favorite virtues to talk about. I hope to bring you into something much bigger than anything one theologian could come up with on his own. Even two of the greatest thinkers on virtue, the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, 384 BC to 322 BC, and the Catholic theologian and doctor of the Church, St. Thomas Aquinas, AD 1225 to 1274, were not teaching in a vacuum and coming up with lists of what they thought were the most important virtues for life. They had entered a tradition that had come before them. They each were stepping into a much larger story about the virtuous life that had already been shaped by several generations of wise teachers and philosophers that preceded them. I aim to bring you into that story, into the rich tradition of virtues, and to do so in a way that is easily accessible to the everyday reader and that inspires, challenges, and encourages you to live virtuous friendships more in your daily life. So if you are longing for virtue to take deep root in your soul and bear fruit in your life, if you're striving to go against the current of the culture and to take on the character of Christ and to be transformed into his likeness from one degree of glory to another, 2 Corinthians 3:18, if you're striving for a deeper and longer lasting transformation in the way you live your faith, friendship, dating, relationships, marriage, and family, then join me as we begin this adventure of rediscovering the great tradition of the virtues and the art of living. Reflection questions. Think of an important relationship you have that you want to strengthen. It could be with a friend, a spouse, a child, a colleague. What is one virtue that you need to work on to help you live that relationship better? What can you do to grow in that virtue? Read 1 Corinthians 13, verses 4 through 7. Why do you think St. Paul lists all these virtues when describing love? What does this tell you about the connection between virtue and love? Which virtue in this list do you think God is inviting you to grow in most? Why? A Dominican preacher of the 19th century, Father Henry Dominique Lacordaire, OP, once described how virtue is needed as we struggle between our attraction to God and our attraction to the vainglory of this world. He said, balanced as we are between these two attractions, we need strength to keep us attached to the polar star of real good, and that strength we call by a still more illustrious name than that of love. We call it virtue. Love without virtue is but weakness and disorder. By virtue it becomes the accomplishment of all duties, the bond that unites us first to God, next to all the creatures of God. It becomes justice and charity. How might love without virtue be weakness and disorder? In what way does virtue enable us to love?